Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. And here we are with Cloud Security Podcast as well. Today is a really, how do I put this? Last week we did container security. If you haven't checked that video, you should check that out. It's a great episode. This week we have Kubernetes, and I have a special guest for this. Given a lot of conversations, has a lot of conversations about this topic. He's part of CNCF as well, and I'm not going to spoil his introduction, but I'm going to bring him in straightforward. But if you're here for the first time, the audio of this episode will be available on the podcast website down at the bottom. If you see that over there, that's www.cloudsecuritypodcast.tv. And today's topic is Kubernetes security at scale in a CI/CD pipeline. But because this is a live show and we love doing this live, so I've got a song for you guys for my guest coming on. Hey, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I'm so glad you came in, man. I think I've been getting Kubernetes questions for so long, so I am so glad I could find you and bring you on the show for some conversation. So first thing first, cheers, man. Oh, there you go. Cheers.
Oh yeah. Cheers. Cheers virtually.
Cheers virtually. Wait, you need to tell me what are you having?
I'm drinking organic nitro cold brew coffee by a company called Trident Coffee, which is a veteran-owned company, and I found them last year, and I've been hooked ever since. So I love it. It's actually, if you could see this, Trident Coffee.
Yeah.
This is a churro keto latte, so no sugar and complete jet fuel.
Keto-friendly cold brew. That's not, especially veteran supported as well. So that's a great idea. I definitely encourage people. I would definitely encourage people to check that out, though. All right, I'm going to start with something obvious. Although I've known you for some time, and I'm sure other people have as well, but some people may still not know who Michael Fraser is. So how did you get into cybersecurity, man? Like, what was your path into this?
Yeah, so I'm veteran myself, ex-Air Force. I like to tell people I started working on physical weapon systems. So I worked on F-15 C and D aircraft on armament weapon systems. And then transitioned into becoming a cybersecurity engineer. So working on digital weapon systems and really being able to focus on being a cybersecurity engineer when I was in. And then I've just been in cybersecurity as a practitioner for about almost 20 years now. I can't believe I can say that at this point. So about 2 decades, which is awesome. And I've been in industry. I've worked, primarily for myself, mostly different cloud consulting / cybersecurity consulting firms. Did a lot of stuff in the VDI space as well. So I was pretty big into that. And then I got bored of that a few years back and decided full steam ahead on DevSecOps, which is where I lived. So that's how I got into Kubernetes and cloud native and so on. And I did a brief period over at Optiv as well as a solution and a cloud security architect. So I've been in industry for a long time and really started out at the very, very beginning in cybersecurity.
That's awesome, man. And I think to your point, it's really interesting for me personally when I see a lot of veterans come into the space of cybersecurity, because it's really very similar in terms of what the jobs are. You're trying to defend either a company or an organization or a whole country as well. By the way, thank you for your service, man. I really appreciate. I'm pretty sure a lot of people appreciate this over here. You have a few highs coming in from Hayden from Twitch, and Vineet also came in. For some reason, he wants me to say a word. I'm just Hayden. I'm just a bit conscious. I shouldn't say the word that you're saying, and I don't know why you want me to say this. So I'm gonna hold back on this. I might talk to you later, Hayden. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. What does cloud security mean for you?
So as I said, I've been in cybersecurity for almost 20 years now, and I've been in the cloud space actually. So one of the first companies I was doing private cloud for the SMB, and this was back in 2009, 2010 timeframe. And so I've been in private cloud before public cloud, and I kind of look at cloud security as really kind of holistically covering security, not just in the public cloud, but also in the private cloud. And now that we're getting into cloud native and DevSecOps, I'm seeing more and more kind of looking at it as holistic automation that includes things like infrastructure as code, cloud services that you can use, both public cloud, and then a lot of these solutions out there also being used in private cloud as well. So there's a lot of hybrid cloud stuff going on out there. And from a cloud security standpoint, you see a lot of things out there like cloud security posture management systems and cloud security tools that are focused primarily around the cybersecurity practitioner. And I, again, look at more of the holistic viewpoint of really wanting cloud security to be a piece of the overall solution that organizations are trying to drive outcomes, to be able to do stuff that they're trying to do and really increase their overall agility. And cloud security is a big piece of that, but I think it's still a part of the overall kind of landscape of where we're trying to move from a technology standpoint. And really, it's a very weighted term because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, just like DevSecOps, right? So I just look at it as, can you apply cybersecurity principles to public and private and hybrid cloud? And is that something that you can maintain more in kind of an agile type of approach? So it's not just, hey, I want to use a point solution that's going to go help me secure this one cloud, looking at also more as multi-cloud. And you may even heard the term now, poly-cloud, where you're using different services and different cloud providers to build a solution.
And while we are on the topic, do you want to quickly touch on what do you mean by DevSecOps as well? I know everyone has their own definition, and probably it's a good segue into kind of nailing that one as well. What do you believe is DevSecOps?
So from a DevSecOps perspective, I view DevSecOps as holistic automation that includes cybersecurity baked into it. So you always hear the term out there, shift left as well. And if it requires cybersecurity to shift left, I also view DevSecOps, a core piece of it, as being a cultural shift to enable collaboration between teams to where Dev, Sec, and Ops can collaborate together and really start building solutions that are based around more of the modern principles that are out there, not just including cloud native, but really looking at if it becomes software defined, say it's infrastructure as code, I want to run an infrastructure as code scanner against it. That's a piece of the overall pipeline and really the life cycle of what I'm trying to build as a solution, and also building things more modularly so that I can incorporate different cybersecurity tools into the process and really start building out more of thinking about things more in an agile approach when it comes to building solutions. And really, so DevSecOps is holistic automation that includes multiple teams and has cybersecurity baked in.
And coming to the topic then, bringing this back to Kubernetes, what is Kubernetes for people who don't even know, like listening for the first time, like, why do I have this whole episode on Kubernetes security? So what is Kubernetes for people who don't know?
Well, first, so Kubernetes was an open source project that came out from Google, pushed it out there, I think it was around 2014. And the name itself is actually based on Greek mythology. It means essentially helmsman or pilot. And it's really about being able to create a portable and extensible open source platform that's very focused on container workloads and being able to incorporate things like infrastructure as code and automation into the process to be able to push things like microservices and other things that you're trying to accomplish when it comes to building out Kubernetes clusters. It's also a lot more of a modern approach to what we're used to in, say, infrastructure as code. And it's also very, I hate to say it, but complicated. So there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is just a piece of what you're trying to use as an overall solution. And there's a lot of things that go into it to be able to really get the end result that you're looking for, not just including cybersecurity into that process, but also thinking about what you're trying to build with Kubernetes and what you're trying to actually accomplish. And so it's really also about the ecosystem around it. So there's a huge community, huge ecosystem, and it's awesome technology. And we actually use it in my startup not just inside of what you can build, but we also are on Kubernetes too with our platform. And there's some reasons why we went that direction, which we can get into on some other questions you may have.
Yeah, sure, man. And I think that's a great way to kind of dive deep into this as well. And I'm going to start with, are we doing this right? And to your point, Kubernetes has been, well, I was going to say has been here for a long time, but sometimes 2, 3 years sounds like a long time in technology these days. So it's been there for a long time. I'm going to say that. Do you feel like security is approaching Kubernetes as a community? Are we approaching Kubernetes the right way? Or is there not enough education in this at the moment?
So when I first got into Kubernetes and we were building stuff out at Refactor, we ran into it where Kubernetes is built as an enterprise product. It was, something that Google had open sourced. And so there were a lot of things inside of Kubernetes when it came to security that we were looking at, stuff like hard multi-tenancy. Can we isolate each tenant in the platform? Are there tools that we can use to scan IAC or the Kubernetes configurations at the very beginning and the IAC that goes around it? And then other tools to run around the deploy and the runtime environments as well. And there's some amazing technology out there, but I'll also say that it's very complicated to add security to Kubernetes, and I don't think people understand how much work it is until you start getting into it. And then I'm thinking about other things around, a Nist or the Center for Internet Security frameworks to be able to use those, or benchmarks, and what those mean for your overall process too. And so to really want to think about is all the moving parts inside of your process to build out your Kubernetes solution and what all is actually going to go into it, and then also trying to future-proof yourself as well, because there's a lot of different tools and technologies out there, and you really want to make sure, like if you're using an additional orchestration layer on top, like OpenShift or Rancher, you want to think about as well, like what you're coupling there into that particular offering versus what may be required for an overall effort on moving to a different Kubernetes orchestration tool, and then all of the security tools that go in there too, which again, stuff like all the way at the very beginning of your process, being able to scan your IAC all the way to the end to your runtime. Like, what are you using for the different tools in that process, and what really makes sense for you? And then also, is it something you can pull out and add in something else later? Because another tool may be more applicable to your use case. So you really want to think about that too, to make it as easy as possible when you're architecting out your Kubernetes pipelines.
It's really interesting that you said that Kubernetes security is complicated, complex. I was going to repeat that myself because I think it's worthwhile calling out. And it is so different to when people just talk about cloud, or that thing in itself is like a beast. And then you almost have another beast pushed into this. I'm thinking of cloud native, and I'm pretty sure there would be questions from people on this as well. And I'll encourage the audience to kind of drop in their questions if they have any further questions to what I'm asking over here. But does it get any different if it is cloud native versus, say, Kubernetes on a regular server versus EKS or GKE and one of those ones which is cloud native to the cloud service provider? Is it any different in terms of challenges, or are they similar?
Well, first off, there's trade-offs. So when you're looking at things like EKS or managed Kubernetes in AWS, or AKS, same thing in Azure or GKE, any of the managed offerings out there, you also have to look on what you have for frameworks or benchmarks. And so a good example of that is at Center for Internet Security. So they have their base Kubernetes benchmark, and then they have specific ones to the managed Kubernetes. And so there's certain things that you can't get access to in the managed, so you're going to be relying upon the cloud provider to provide that. And they do a fairly good job when it comes to being able to provide certain things, certain security controls around, some of the infrastructure that the Kubernetes is in. And then you also want to think about, and we're actually going through this at Refactor, we're engaged with the Air Force with their Platform One initiative, and one of the pieces of our SBIR Phase 2, it's Small Business Innovation Research project, is that it's about being able to have Kubernetes that can run vanilla, and then what does that also look like in the different managed Kubernetes offerings out there, and then who's using it, right? Too, and what and does it work, both in the commercial side and on the the DID, IC, or Intel community side offerings from the cloud providers too. So we think about that, and then the other piece is what are some of the dependencies that are required in order to be able to have a solution that's using the managed Kubernetes offering, and then what am I using to also scan there? So like IAC, I'll still be able to at least be able to scan different things when I'm building out my containers and pushing them out to the registry and so on. But then you also want to think about, what kind of coverage do I have on the core infrastructure, and can I get any information about that from the cloud providers versus controlling that myself? And then the last part to that is, am I looking to deploy this into my own private cloud? Am I going to use things like PKS or in VMware, or start thinking about like, what does that look like? So do I need a vanilla flavor of Kubernetes that I can add dependencies to when I deploy it to the managed, or I'm using other orchestration solutions like Rancher or OpenShift? So you want to be thinking about all of that when you're thinking also about the security implications and what you're going to be using tooling wise. And a lot of the automation that you can create for this, you just have to incorporate where in the process am I incorporating that, and what do I actually get access to. And so I always think about anything that's going to come from the cloud. If I don't have full control over all of the infrastructure, and I'm not even going to have control over, say, the hypervisor or other layers when it comes to this. So do I control the VM? Am I deploying Kubernetes into the VMs? Do I have control over that? Do I need to understand the security controls over that? And then also, again, around the IAC, around the deploy and the runtime, what can I incorporate into there that I can use in whatever version of Kubernetes I decide to hone in on and decide that's best for me and my organization.
You dropped in so many gems there, man. I hope people rewind this and listen to this again. But I'm going to touch on something that you did, which I thought is worthwhile calling out again. There would be some responsibilities that you probably hand off to the provider. And you mentioned that the US Air Force is also trying to put Kubernetes in. That's pretty awesome. Mm-hmm. And for me, the way I listen to that is like, if I'm a regulated body listening to this, if I'm a bank or any other regulated body, I can utilize Kubernetes as well. Actually, that begs the question: why would you want to put Kubernetes to begin with? Is it the scalability? Because you mentioned earlier, Kubernetes is like an enterprise-ready software. Like, why, if you had a choice to build a solution, what would make you go towards Kubernetes, even from a security perspective or in general? Like, or why would you go other way? Is there like a separation there?
So the first thing I would say is Kubernetes is not for everybody. So don't just jump into Kubernetes just because.
I'm glad you said that.
Because sometimes just deploying VMs is totally acceptable for your use case. So don't think that you have to go in Kubernetes because it's the coolest thing that everybody's getting into now. But that being said, I would say, when you're looking at your architecture and you're trying to figure out what makes sense for the applications you're building, there's some definite benefits to Kubernetes from a scale perspective. And then there's also benefits from, again, what am I trying to accomplish? Am I trying to also, separate my state from my stateless? Can I create immutable infrastructure that's really going to help drive what I'm trying to accomplish at scale? And then the other piece of it is, what am I, like for us at Refactor, we looked at, we needed to have an execution environment to be able to execute the tools that we support and what we call our runners. And so we were looking at Kubernetes as, all right, is that something we can use for the runner environment? Is that something we can also use on the application side? How many different services are we building out to be able to scale this thing out so that we can support, the initial customer base and then also supporting the customer base at scale? There's also the compliance around it as well. So one of the things we looked at is we're using AKS and Azure right now for our PaaS-based version, our platform as a service-based version of the platform. And then we looked at, does it make sense for us to take what we have and have it as a deployable Kubernetes version? And also, does it make sense to support the different managed Kubernetes versions out there as well? And so we were looking at a lot of these like EKS and AKS and GKE, they have various different supports on the government side from the different impact levels that they support. And so it really depends on the end customer and what they can do on what type of version of Kubernetes. So can they use the managed? Is it supported in GovCloud at a particular IA level? Do they have to support their own? On the DoD side, they're very sensitive to needing to obviously have control over anything that they deploy. They also have a cool registry, container registry called Iron Bank, where they push out certified containers that are available out there as well. And actually, you can go and check it out as well. A lot of the stuff is available just to the general public, or you can go sign up and check out what they're doing. And so your question about the Air Force side. So this is the one time, and I tell some of my Air Force counterparts, that I see that the DoD is on par with the commercial sector, and usually they're laggers behind. They want to make sure that technology is out there and completely proven. And it's really interesting to see how the government side is really pushing the envelope when it comes to being able to support products like, solutions like Kubernetes quicker, and really looking to use it to help to modernize, to be able to support the more of the containerized approach, so that they can provide different applications and tools, and really to build solutions that work for the warfighter. But also on the commercial side, I'm seeing the same kind of push to can we pare down particular solutions that we're creating where we can have individual services that are provided on a per container basis. And so when you start thinking about that, you start going, okay, maybe Kubernetes makes sense, but scale is key. And then also what you're trying to accomplish, the complexity of the type of application that you're creating, and then assessing, does it make sense for me to use Kubernetes or not? And there's a lot of enterprises out there that are using Kubernetes on their application side because they need the scale, they need the capabilities to be able to scale out their solution, their application in a in a more of an elastic type way that not just the cloud providers support, but that they can also get from being able to scale out with Kubernetes.
Wow, dude, you just keep dropping gems in there. That's pretty awesome. So again, I hope you will rewind this and just listen in all the comprehensive overview that you gave us on this. So I'm going to talk about more from a CI/CD pipeline. I know we touched on DevSecOps earlier as well, and we touched on how Kubernetes is complex, security in Kubernetes is complex. You should only go down the path of doing Kubernetes if you really feel you need to scale at that level, not just also outside of your cloud provider as well. Now, suppose I've made the decision, yes, Kubernetes is the right choice for me. And as a security person, I'm going to start looking at, okay, great, we have Kubernetes deployments now. What are some of the initial building blocks from a security perspective that I should be kind of looking at in terms of ticking off when trying to build this into a CI/CD pipeline, or maybe even start building the foundation for pieces for this? So how do I start deploying Kubernetes security, I guess?
So from a Kubernetes perspective, I look at, you also have to think about all the surrounding things that you need as well. So various things from, say, credentialing. Again, IAC scan, I keep bringing that up because that's very important. All of the tools that you're trying to scan your container, then also being able to scan runtimes as well. And then thinking about all of the other scans that you're already trying to do with whatever you have inside of Kubernetes, because you're using Kubernetes for a purpose, right? Which is to be able to push out applications. And so what am I also doing from an application standpoint? So when I talk about the complexities of Kubernetes, you really have to think about it holistically and all of the pieces and parts that you also have to support from an enterprise perspective, because your enterprise, may be using the latest and greatest stuff. Like I can do my credentials and secrets from something like HashiCorp Vault, which is really nice to add into a CI/CD pipeline. But I may be using other things like more traditionally on the cybersecurity teams, like using CyberArk, for instance. And so I really have to be thinking about, how do I incorporate what the enterprise is using from a cybersecurity tool perspective? And a lot of this incumbent products that came about before we got into not just Kubernetes, but also, to your other point, on the CI/CD pipeline perspective. And how can I start building using these existing products that I have in my enterprise inside of my pipelining process, and then also thinking about what I'm trying to incorporate into that pipelining process and how I can not just build the infrastructure and incorporate the tools into that process, but also thinking about the implications of what I'm trying to accomplish from a whatever applications I'm using too, because I may end up using one particular CI/CD to do my build process, and I may use another one. I see organizations do that, another one to be able to build the infrastructure and then combine them all together. So you may look at GitHub or GitLab to be able to do the CI side. I see organizations using things like CodeFresh and Harness on the more of the CD or the continuous deployment or delivery side. So it's really about figuring what makes sense for your organization, and also which tools make the most sense for when you're building this out. And then also what is supported from a security tooling perspective, because you may want to use a full suite like like Twistlock or it's called Prisma now by Palo Alto Networks, but you may also look at like Aqua Security and so on. And I also like to point out too, like sometimes the open source version of tools is completely acceptable to start using out of the gate. And then when it makes sense for you to move over to the commercial tool, the commercial offering alongside of that, but you got to start from somewhere, which is really nice, to be able to use some of these open source version of these tools. And I take that approach at Refactor, where we believe it's a mixture of open source and commercially available tools, and it's not skewed one side or another. There's really a mixture in every enterprise that really makes sense when you're trying to incorporate these various tools into your pipelining process.
Right. And what I wanted, this is making me think, Kubernetes has its own management platform layer, like the management layer on it, and you can have multiple pods, and it kind of goes into the whole service mesh and everything. If I were to decide on working on integrating Kubernetes security into my pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, definitely makes sense. If you already have security products in place, you just try and incorporate them and then overlay on top of that Kubernetes platform. But if I'm thinking about this and I've never done a CI/CD pipeline with Kubernetes before, am I better off thinking about my Kubernetes architecture first? Like almost, it comes across like a chicken and egg situation. I know with the CI/CD pipeline versus should I start with Kubernetes first or should I start with CI/CD pipeline first? If I don't have either Kubernetes first or CI/CD pipeline first, what do you recommend?
I'd recommend you figure out what you're actually trying to accomplish first, because you're like starting from the base of what you're trying to accomplish. Somebody actually asked the question. So Vinette, in your opinion, which is the best use case for Kubernetes?
Oh, yeah.
So that goes kind of hand in hand with what you just asked. And so I look at when you're first off, using Kubernetes, especially if you already have existing applications, is going to require a refactor. So you're going to have to look at, how am I going to refactor this application to be able to be used within the architecture of Kubernetes. The second piece is if you're starting from greenfield, you really want to look at first what you're trying to build out from an application standpoint, how many different services that you have, and does it really actually make sense to use Kubernetes? Again, it may make sense just to use virtual machines. You don't need everything that Kubernetes brings to the table. So you really want to assess the architecture of what you're trying to build there. And the third piece, and the question was, so when do we need to be able to scale? So that's really when you're looking at how many different services that you have and you're building them out. And does it make sense to also have the ability to update individual services, be able to roll out as you expand user usage of your overall application? And then also, what does that look like from an infrastructure standpoint as you're scaling it out on the cloud provider? And so you want to assess those things as you're building out your application. So I've seen organizations where they go straight to Kubernetes, and it's like, you didn't need to do that. You should have really focused on like what you're trying to build from a software standpoint first before you get into like, getting into Kubernetes, because Kubernetes actually requires a fair amount of management as well to be able to support. Yeah. And so if you don't have the support structure in place too, it's going to be very difficult if you're not thinking about those things as well, aside from the cybersecurity standpoint. And that would be the last thing I would say is, it's very easy to run a benchmark against a rel 7 VM and run some remediation against it and make sure that it's hardened and you have your application on it. It's a little more difficult when you have all the different moving parts in Kubernetes to support your your master nodes, your worker nodes, your overall cluster, your different pods, the containers. So now you have various layers of requirements of what you need to support from a security posture standpoint, and then tooling around that. And so you really also want to think about the level of support that it's going to take you to support from a cybersecurity tooling standpoint, let alone just supporting Kubernetes.
I love the answer, because I often find people underestimating the deployment of Kubernetes. I sometimes see that as like a mini data center being deployed. It's not just that you have, it's not, I guess, it's not like an EC2 instance. It's not a server that you just bring up and shut down. It's like a whole data center that you just support with its own management layer, and it could have sub-containers like pods and everything. Oh, yeah, man. I think I'm so glad you brought it up, and I'll definitely emphasize on that for people who may be thinking about this, that right tool for the right job, but understand there's a lot of work in supporting Kubernetes. So wherever you put it in, there's another layer to that. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and actually somebody else asked a question around applying runtime security controls on Kubernetes Ingress controller versus using service mesh. So that actually brings up another good point, which is the networking layer on Kubernetes, and also policy. So there's a whole nother layer that you can have applied from a policy standpoint using things like OPA or Open Policy Agent, or HashiCorp Sentinel, or various different tools that you can use for policy around your Kubernetes configuration too, or other things that work around there too. So, and then you can also manage policy in some regard in each of the cloud providers too. So you have to think again about the overall complexities of the different layers of when you're building out Kubernetes, because it's not just like, hey, here's a little infrastructure on the cloud provider and I'm good to go. And then the other piece that you think about too is Kubernetes can be somewhat difficult from a development standpoint too, when you're trying to ensure that developers can have the Kubernetes cluster experience when they're trying to deploy things as well, to go test things out as well. So you also want to think about what that actually means too when you're trying to build out your development workflow too, because and then where are you incorporating your cybersecurity tooling into the mix, because that also can either slow down your development velocity, or if you do it right, it could actually not slow it down at all if you have scans and remediation happening at certain places. I was like looking at where you can kind of decouple things from your process to make it a better developer experience, so it doesn't cause any sort of issues with speed or velocity.
That's really interesting, and I hope we answered Vinny's question and Ubaid's question as well. But I'm just wondering if we directly answered. What are your thoughts on applying runtime security controls on Kubernetes Ingress controller versus a service mesh? Like, do you have a preference between using the Ingress controller versus a service mesh for layer 7 security policy control?
I don't have a preference, but I would say that that's again kind of looking where additional management layers. So if you're using something like Istio, adding that additional layer to the mix. So why are you doing it? Does it make sense for you at scale? I mean, it's going to make sense for you at scale. And then also, like, where are you starting and what kind of controls do you have in place? So being able to apply security controls in the Ingress controller is fine out of the gate. But then you really want to assess, again, the level of complexity that you're adding with service mesh, and then who's supporting it, how you're going to support that, and how you're being able to support that at scale. But a lot of organizations are using service mesh because it does help to make it easier at scale, but you have to put a lot of time and effort in on the front end to do it right.
Great point, man. Great point. Hopefully we answered your question, Ubaid. Feel free to kind of give a follow-up. I've got Frank here as well, who's mentioned we started using OSCAP and Claire, and now evaluating Prisma and Aqua. Oh, that's a good one. I think Trend has something in the offering as well, but I thought Claire was more containers, not Kubernetes. It's
it is container. So that, I mean, that's the thing is, like, when you're using container scanning, you push it out to a registry, then you use those containers in your Kubernetes cluster. So you want to think about the scanning process there. OpenSCAP is a how do I put this nicely? It's a very interesting tool that has
Yes.
a lot of things about it that a lot of folks don't like using. So we actually we support OpenSCAP at Refactor. We also support Syscat Assessor, which is a CIS a tool by Center for Internet Security, and some of the nuances of how these tools are able to be utilized inside of your pipelining process, and then also how you're scanning, not just when you're doing the hardening of your images, but if you're trying to run real-time scans as well. So you really want to be thinking about that. And then also, again, how much support. So Claire also takes a fair amount of effort to get up and running and support.
Yeah.
We actually integrated, because it's a better tool to start out with, Aqua Trivi, which is an open source version from Aqua Security. Great tool and great tool to get started with, easier than Claire, although Claire is fine from an open source standpoint. If you're looking for a platform and an enterprise versions of those, I would definitely look at Prisma and Aqua Security's enterprise version. But you also want to start, if you can, with the open source version of some of these other commercial counterparts, so that you can start getting acclimated with their tooling and how that's going to be incorporated into your process. And then I would also, kind of shifting more left, look at IAC scanners too. So work with like Bridgecrews Checkoff and Accurix TerraScan. There's some others coming out. Checkmarx just released one, which I thought was very interesting, and so did and I think Checkpoint's releasing one called Shift Left as well. But anyway, there's more and more IAC scanners coming out too, to be able to look at as well, even before you get to the actual scanning of your images and pushing them to the registry.
Yeah, I think Bridgecrew has one as well for Kubernetes or Terraforms. I mean, there's plenty of people coming in the infrastructure as code scanning space, so definitely good. Hopefully, it give you some insight, Frank. But if you have a question as well, feel free to kind of drop that in. Great answer from Vinny. So I think we answered his question. Andrew reckons your Refactor logo looks like Azure All Resources logo. It kind of does, actually.
I think our logo looks better. So I'll give you a kind of the reason behind our logo. So it's to show what we consider a pipeline or a template, and so we did a play on that before we looked at any other logos out there. But that's and there's an R in there, so you can see the little R, and that's and that was the genesis of the logo. So my co-founder and Anthony and I actually built it together, and we've kept with it ever since. We actually went through a whole new branding effort, but we kept our original logo. But I think, Andrew, our logo is cooler than the All Resources logo from Azure. But don't tell Microsoft
that. This would it's just between all of us, Andrew. Microsoft should never find out. Okay, I'm going to revert to some of my questions, because I've been trying to ask. So now we've spoken about the right tool for the right job, looking at Kubernetes from a deployment, whether you actually need it, and the complexity around each layer, whether you can reuse some of the already existing security products. Is there like a benchmark or something that people can use to match, I guess, their maturity against? Oh, there's another one.
Absolutely. So there's been some amazing progress by organizations out there around being able to support benchmarking and being able to do assessments around that. So Center for Internet Security has a Kubernetes just a plain Kubernetes deployment benchmark that you can do assessments against. The benchmark itself is free, so you can actually go pull down a PDF on there. What I would say with that is there's also benchmarks now coming out. They support some around the managed Kubernetes. Again, kind of like understanding the differences and the nuances between not just the different managed versions, but also against the just the pure Kubernetes deployment, if you're incorporating all the infrastructure as well. And then there's also Nist. So Nist has also 800, I think it's 190, which covers some on the container side, and there's a few others as well that you can go out there and look at as well. What I like to say about these, though, is they're a good way to look at a baseline, but you're going to want to have some sort of tooling around it to be able to ensure that you can run your assessments more in an automated way. And there's a lot of vendors out there doing, the ability to scan around some of these benchmarks and assessments that you can use. Everybody from Tenable to Tufin to, there's all kinds of vendors out there that have this type of functionality. And so you want to look though at like what works for me from a open source version perspective. Can I use that tool? Does it make sense to use that to get started? And then what would make sense to make the investment into the commercial tool, especially when you're looking at scaling, and what's going to make sense there. And then what kind of coverage you're trying to get as well. So some of these products out there have a lot of coverage around the entire life cycle of your Kubernetes deployment. Some of them are just point solutions, just purely to do the assessment side. I also work with other companies like a customer of ours called MindPoint Group that builds content out there as well around Ansible. So there's actually a Kubernetes baselines, essentially remediation content out there too. So again, you kind of want to look at, the different pieces and parts, and is there open source stuff out there I can use and make my own? Am I gonna, want to use the commercial version because it makes more sense for me to have that from the cybersecurity vendor? And so you just want to look and assess, what makes the most sense for you, your organization. And again, start small. Don't try to get all the way into the weeds, but plan accordingly. So you want to architect and start small, but when you're architecting, you want to look at the big picture. You also want to look at, from an architectural standpoint, what are some changes that would just not work when I scale this out? So is it something that I'm going to have, am I using a managed version of Kubernetes, but when I want to scale this out, I really need to have access to the underlying, infrastructure because I have to do other things in my organization to know what my security posture is on that. Or maybe I have to support it because I'm, a VMware shop and I have to support it in my private cloud. So you just want to start thinking about things like that and how you're building out your automation. And then the other thing on the CI/CD pipelining side is really think about building things modularly where you can run them against different things. And so an example of that is if I can have certain scans run against Kubernetes, can I use that both if I have Kubernetes up and running in my private cloud and in my public cloud? And so you really want to think about reusability when it comes to creating your pipelines so that you can, as we like to say in the software engineer world, the dry approach, don't repeat yourself, right? You want everything to be automated from a repeatable standpoint, and you don't want to have to build things, multiple times.
That's a great answer. And for me, personally, as a CISO, I always feel my calls are usually, if I'm going for an open source version, not minus the support part, if I don't have the team with the skill set that can code and can deep dive into this, I feel like that should also be a consideration for a lot of people kind of considering, hey, should we go open source or commercial? Definitely need the understanding of the product space, but I feel if you don't have the right team to support you, build that cybersecurity or Kubernetes security at scale in a CI/CD pipeline, you should probably look at some kind of commercial offering. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So that's a great question, because a part of what I say about open source too is don't underestimate how much time and essentially cost it is to the people supporting it in your organization. And to the second point, who in your organization is going to be supporting this? But also on the flip side of that, don't think of that the commercial offering is just going to solve all of your problems too. So you really want to look at how you balance it out. And somebody, I think Kevin said, use open source first to find easy fixes, which helps you become both more secure and then convince management to invest more into security. And I would also say, like, proving out that these tools will work for you on the open source side first to show something that's quantifiable. So, because the executive levels who you're trying to sell in your organization are going to want something that they can actually see and that you're able to actually prove to them to be able to get the commercial version of what you're looking to do. So I would absolutely agree with that. And then I also agree with Kevin. There's there's free tiers, there's community editions, there's open source. So look at what that means. A lot of times community edition, and we have this at Refactor too, is a hosted free version. So you don't have to spend all the time trying to set something up. You can get out there and start using it, but trying to still keep the level of effort on your end as minimally as possible, because you're really doing a proof of concept yourself when using open source tools to prove out on the front end when you're building this stuff out. And then CI/CD pipelines can become very complicated. So again, start small when you're trying to prove this out so that you can show something to your executive leadership to be able to get the investment and buy into this. And then the other piece that I would say too is really look at commercial tools that can also help you with collaboration, because you really want cybersecurity working together with your DevOps and cloud architects and so on, because this is a collaborative effort. You're building a solution. You're not just building, something for one team. This is going to be something that you have to have multiple teams involved in.
Yep.
And I said this on another talk last week, or the Hashi Talks. It's very cliche, but it's really about breaking down the silos from a culture standpoint, because you can't have cybersecurity siloed away from this, because it's an integral part of what you're trying to build. And it's not just Kubernetes, it's like an agile automation process where you're trying to build a solution, and Kubernetes can be one of those solutions in your process. But you really want to think about the culture shift and the culture change that you're trying to get in an organization. And that also requires the CTO and the CISO and the CIO to all be communicating and working together, not working against each other because, I want this for my budget, or I want this for my budget. It really has to be a collaborative effort at the top executive level when it comes to this culture change internally, which is what we're talking about too. Not just about Kubernetes, but around this whole modernization and where everybody's going from a technology standpoint.
I'm so glad you touched on the culture part. And whether it's DevSecOps, Kubernetes, or containers, all of that would fail if there's no culture to support it. So very well said. And it brings me to the next question. We kind of spoke about some of the challenges in CI/CD pipeline. Are there any current fires that you feel that are happening in the space that should be addressed in terms of Kubernetes security? Or misconceptions that are there around Kubernetes security in terms of reality versus expectation, I guess?
Yeah, I would take one step back from that. So we all know about the major SolarWinds, the SolarWinds breach, which is really a supply chain issue. And I talk a lot now about software bill of materials, really about the overall supply chain, knowing the integrity of what you're trying to build. And that applies to everything, right? So that does apply to Kubernetes too, because you have to understand what's in your process at every step, whether it's at the very beginning when you're building your source code, all the way to the end when you're releasing a production. And then anything that you're building around it being software defined, or as I like to call it, IT as code. But it's like, if it's software, it's in a pipeline, you need to know what's going on at every step in your pipelining process. And then also, things like SolarWinds, the key there is to know the integrity of what's actually in your pipelining process, and really focusing in on, can I have more evidence in this step that I can have available? Can I verify the integrity of these, whether it's external libraries, or other things like, hey, I'm pulling in a container image from a public repository. You have to think also about, like, do I need to have my own private repository? Do I want to be able to ensure the integrity of this myself? So you have to be thinking about all of those things as you're looking to build out your pipelining process. And Kubernetes is a piece of that process. But if you shift all the way to the beginning of that process, you want to incorporate the SAST and DAST and IA scanning all the way at the very beginning of your process before you even start thinking about Kubernetes. So it's really, again, holistically thinking about it as you're creating solutions. I think Kevin said something else: collaboration tools.
Yes.
Keep your audit risk team from sending. Yes. Everybody hates spreadsheets. So actually, I'll hone in on another thing around this. So we actually at Center for Internet Security, we work with them closely, and we're helping them to automate their benchmarking process, because the benchmark is just that, a spreadsheet right now, or the assessment for the benchmark process. And it's funny how this process just generally out there in the industry is still a lot of manual handoffs, exactly to Kevin's point. And so if we can start building automation around it, even if it's for visibility, to know what's at every step of my pipelining process, do I know exactly what tools and automation content and configurations in there, then I can start also knowing if this configuration drifts, or if somebody introduces a malicious package or dependency, I can have visibility of that as quickly as possible. And so it's really, again, thinking about this holistically, because you really want to be thinking about every step inside of your process. And if it's a spreadsheet, that's a manual process, and there's a high likelihood that there's going to be introduced some sort of human error, or something happened, or somebody didn't look at a particular control, because it's a manual process. So thinking about where you can automate it. But I also come from the other side, just like I'm saying with Kubernetes from a complexity standpoint. You also want to think about automating a certain percentage. Don't try to go out there and say, I'm going to automate 100% of this. If you can automate 50, 60% of it, it's still okay to have some manual steps inside of your process. The goal is that you're making progress to try to automate as much as possible, so that you can be proactive in your process, not reactive when something happens and there's an incident that happens, where now you're spending a ton of time trying to figure out what happened, and you have no visibility on what's going on in your process, your pipelining process.
Cool. And by the way, shout out to Kevin for dropping some gems in there as well. That brings me to the question of maturity then. If someone listening to this has been doing Kubernetes deployments for some time in the environment, what's an example of like a really mature Kubernetes? Is that like a proactive, like, I don't know, what would like a top-notch mature Kubernetes deployment look like versus, I guess, the beginning one is what we've been talking about. What do you think on that? Like, what's a mature Kubernetes deployment?
That's a good question. I guess the question is, are there mature Kubernetes deployments out there? I'd probably say some large organizations like Netflix or Capital One, people that have been doing it for a long period of time. But I would also say there's like the use case around, why do I need to be using it? I need to scale. I need to be able to have the capabilities of a lot of the benefits that Kubernetes brings to the table from an automation and self-healing standpoint. But I would also think about from a maturity standpoint, a lot of people are looking at Kubernetes because they're moving from on-premise to the public cloud or cloud native, and so it's really thinking about what am I trying to do when I'm refactoring my applications. What does that look like? And then the other piece is, a lot of organizations, like if you're starting greenfield or you're a startup, it's going to be easier to assess, does this make sense for me from the very first day that you're building out your offer, your product. But for people that are refactoring their applications into cloud native, you really have to assess what that looks like. What that looks like from your own maturity standpoint. Do you have existing, a pipelining process in place? So does that make it easier to get where you're trying to get with Kubernetes? And then also, again, all of the things that go along with it. So from a cybersecurity tooling standpoint, like, what do I need to have in there to just have my baseline or my MVP? And then over time, what does that look like from a maturity standpoint? Like, where am I trying to get with that? Because it's going to be a consistent evolution of what you're trying to do. And then also the thing to think about is net new products come out too. So you really want to be careful about locking yourself into any. Everybody talks about like vendor lock-in, and at some point you're going to pick tools, you're going to pick a solution that you're going to use, you're going to have some sort of lock-in, but you want to think about the pieces and parts around your Kubernetes solution, and can you decouple or pull that out and add in something else at a later point that makes it easy to slightly change the architecture, but also continues to help you evolve and mature your overall offering. And I guess the last point I make is, I would say that most organizations are still not super mature when it comes to Kubernetes. So it's still an ongoing evolution of just organizations embracing it and looking at it as an option for them when they're building out their applications.
Right. And I've got an interesting question here as well. Well, don't worry, man. It's not a dumb question. Does Kubernetes security contribute to an organization's overarching data loss prevention program? If yes, how?
Does it contribute to an overarching data loss or DLP program? That's a good question. It can, but you're just looking at it again as something that you're trying to support for the enterprise at large. So I would just look at it as another solution that you need to have coverage on, and being able to know how that ties into your existing DLP program, and then any tools that you're using from that perspective tool. So if you have things in line that's able to pull data out of the network that you have around Kubernetes or the infrastructure, that's fine. As for like anything else that you have, say it's the applications that are inside Kubernetes, you would still cover them as you would with any DLP program and tool set around that. So I would just, it'd be something else that you would just have coverage over in that program. But absolutely should be something you should be looking at to cover in there, especially if you're supporting particularly production workloads. But if you're doing Kubernetes, you have multiple environments you're supporting as well.
Awesome. Hopefully that answered your question, man. The other question that I have is from Ubaid. And the question is, what are your thoughts on striking the right balance between service velocity, scale, architecture, security, and running costs? As an example, when dev teams request dedicated EKS clusters versus Kubernetes multi-tenancy security and costs. I love this question. What are your thoughts on this? Tough one, though.
So it is about striking the right balance, and also like what are the developers needing from you? Like what are they trying? You need an environment they can do their day-to-day job. And so the question there is, are you building environments for them that actually covers kind of what you're talking about? So is there enough architecture in them for them to actually do their day-to-day job as they're building software? From a security standpoint, like what are you securing in those environments versus what you have to secure in production? And they could be one and the same, but most likely you may have additional coverages that you have to have in production. And then what is the bare bone minimum that you can have to strike that balance for a dev environment versus a full production environment? So you really want to look at that. And then the other thing is, I would use the public cloud wherever I could if I can control spinning up and spinning down these environments versus having them on my own infrastructure, or having the same layer, automation layer over that as well, because I want to make sure that I know how much uptime that they require and make sure that that infrastructure is only up for that time. And the last piece of that is, from a security standpoint, where do I need to incorporate security scans into the process to ensure that I have the coverage I need as the enterprise, but also what is going to impede the developer speed and velocity? So can I do that, off of particular branches that's not going to cause them to slow down? Do I have particular scans, in when I'm trying to, harden around the infrastructure that they're using too? So a lot of times you may not have fully hardened infrastructure for a dev environment that you'd have in production. And then also, how are they accessing that environment too? So there's some really cool technologies out there you can use also from a hosted standpoint. Coder.com is another one. Great, interesting solution. And they're looking at like moving towards a hosted dev experience to kind of help solve for this. So there are companies out there trying to solve for this too, aside from you doing this yourself and having your own dev environment spun up. So hopefully I answer your question.
Thank you. I think Kevin just has another gem he's dropping in there. DevSecOps software lifecycle infinity diagram comes from US DoD. I'll definitely encourage people to Google that. I'm curious myself, so I might look that up later. Thanks for that, Kevin. It's brought another question on this, right? Now, after listening to you, Michael, people have gone pumped, like, oh my God, Kubernetes is the bomb. So is there a place where they can probably kickstart this learning process of Kubernetes as well? Like, I think it's worthwhile calling out. I feel like as security folks who are being introduced to containers, Kubernetes, and cloud and all this, there's obviously an education gap as well. Is there any recommendation that you have, kind of like, that kind of sparked based on Kevin's question here, or Kevin's statement here? Is there anything that you recommend as a good source for learning about Kubernetes that you have found useful as well, and others may find as well from a security perspective?
So to Kevin's point, and I love that diagram too, and have been working closely with the DevSecOps initiative with the Air Force. Now that's spreading out with Navy and Army and so on. There's a lot of good resources out there around Kubernetes and DevSecOps and what they're trying to accomplish, from a DoD perspective. But a lot of this information is out there that's totally accessible to anybody that wants to get into it. So that would be a good place that I would start. There's the chief officer of the Air Force, Nicholas Chilean. He has there's a whole site about all this stuff. Some of the stuff I mentioned earlier around like Iron Bank, and there's a thing called Repo One, which has all kinds of cool content out there. And there's just a lot of presentations out there too that I would go check out. that you can get information about as well. And getting into it, I'd say start off small. Even stuff like stuff we're doing a refactor, we're very focused on, hey, you should be able to start building out pipelines that maybe just spin up a managed Kubernetes cluster, and then you can look at, okay, now how do I incorporate these particular tools into the process, and I can start adding in security into the mix. But you got to start out with knowing what Kubernetes is and how it works, and then how you're going to apply security to it. And so you really want to start small, get a Kubernetes cluster up and running. I'd recommend doing a managed version of one of the cloud providers. And then from there, you can start incorporating different tools into the process, but start small.
That's awesome. That's awesome advice. I'm gonna just, switch gears, but before I did that, I just wanted to get your thoughts on where do you see the Kubernetes space go? And I know so people have almost stopped talking about containers. It almost feels like no one's talking about containers. Everyone's talking about Kubernetes. Do you feel this is here to stay, or where do you see the future for Kubernetes?
I do. I think that we're just kind of on the verge of the overall opportunity for Kubernetes as a whole, and then I would say one step above that from DevSecOps, which is where I live and breathe. And it's only going to get more and more. It's only going to grow bigger and bigger. So I would say that it's gonna become a much larger market. The other thing I would say to that though too is we're going to see a lot more AI, ML type of offerings applied into there, because as people are scaling and growing out the data sets on what they're creating from a Kubernetes cluster or Kubernetes standpoint, there's also going to be a lot of data that we can use to further enhance and make it better. So I'll see that. And then I'll also say that Kubernetes is not the end all be all. We talk in 2 or 3 years from now, there'll probably be something new out there that's going to be, it's going to take over what Kubernetes is. From a popularity standpoint and kind of where people are pushing, but I think it's we're just at the tip of the iceberg on what's going to be possible in the growth from a Kubernetes standpoint.
Awesome. I've got my favorite person from Singapore here, Jerome. Bonjour. USAF's Kissel run is a good illustration of how Agile and DevSecOps bring value to organizations. There you go. Another great resource. So that was kind of like the technical questions I had, and I know we've been talking about some serious stuff for so long, so I'm going to switch gears, and I've got some 3 fun questions for you, man, so people can get to know the other side of Michael as well. The 3 questions that I have. First one, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on cloud, Kubernetes, containers? So what are you spending most time doing outside of this?
Well, I would say having a startup, I have very limited time on this, but I love to snowboard. Before the pandemic and everything was shut down, I'm a huge CrossFitter as well, so I love CrossFit. That's another thing of mine. And then I spend a lot of time with the family too, and I have a 6-year-old autistic daughter, so I like taking her out and going on little adventures with her. So actually, we just had a snowstorm not even a week ago, so we went out snowshoeing here in Seattle, so that was interesting.
Oh, right, there you go. Great answers, by the way. Snowshoeing sounds like a great activity. What is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Oh, that's a great question. I pretty much put everything out there on social media.
I think most people
I wouldn't say everything out there, but everything from a occupation or job standpoint.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because that's it. A lot of people actually say they're proud of their family or things that they've achieved themselves. So kind of like what you just said as well. People would not really put their families out. I mean, especially cybersecurity people, they don't really want to put a lot of their family out there. Although the family puts themselves out there, that's a very different story, I guess. But
I have 2 things there. One is actually it's out there, but I don't know how much people know that. So my wife's actually a co-founder. She's been a co-founder of I think 5 companies with me since we got married.
Wow.
12 plus years ago. So we've been together for a long time, but we also have had multiple companies together. So I think that, and then the other thing I would say too that's not out there. So I was homeschooled as a kid, and I got a waiver to go in the Air Force. So I actually never graduated high school, but I have a bachelor's and master's in computer science. So I'm probably the only person that doesn't actually have a high school diploma, but I do have a bachelor's and master's degree. So,
Wow, with that, dude, that's really interesting. I definitely didn't know that. And by the way, I'm gonna definitely talk about the secrets of having your wife as a co-founder and having successful startups as well. There you go. People are definitely amazed by it. Like, how can you do that? And plus, you're not graduating high school. That's some great insight, man. Last question: what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share with us?
Oh, that's a great question too. So actually, I'm a huge paleo keto person. So
Mm-hmm.
there's actually a restaurant here about 10 minutes away from me in Bothell called Revolve Food and Wine, and they make the best paleo chicken tenders and various other food. And actually, that's my daughter's favorite chicken tenders too. She's a very picky eater, and she loves those chicken tenders too. So I'd probably say my favorite restaurant
Wow.
right now is
I'm
out
definitely
in
gonna check that
Bothell.
out when I go
Yeah.
there. Yeah, wow, thank you. Thank you so much for this, man. I'm sure people want to get in touch with you and know a lot more about Kubernetes and everything else that Michael and Refactor are doing. Where is the best socials for them to reach out to you? Where can they reach out to you,
So I'm
man? LinkedIn,
everywhere
Twitter?
as IT is code. So you can look up IT is code. That's kind of my trademark phrase right now, and that's how you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter. I think I'm on Instagram, Facebook, but not because I want to be on there, but I'm on there as well. So you
All of
can
us, my
find me. And
friend.
I'm actually I just joined Clubhouse not too long ago, too. So I'm on there. And actually, I'm thinking about doing going to do some rooms. I have some other industry leaders that want to start doing some conversations on there. So that'll be pretty good, too. So we should probably do something on Clubhouse, too.
I know. I was gonna say because I moderate the rooms for cybersecurity, cloud security over there as well. So if anyone's on Clubhouse, definitely feel free to connect, and we should definitely do something over there for more conversations like this, man. Dude, thank you so much for coming in, and I definitely cannot wait to bring you back in because I'm pretty sure a lot of people would have want to know the next layer of Kubernetes as well. Once we go start deeper into this, and what else is out there from a scaling perspective. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm definitely looking forward to having you back again, man. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, looking forward to our next session. And yeah, I could talk for hours on this. So I'm totally open for another episode in the future.
Awesome. And for everyone else who's watching, this would be live on the podcast as an audio as well soon. So again, the website is down at the bottom, but we will see you next week. Thank you so much for your time. Peace.